Okay. Make sure this is working correctly. Bum, 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 bum. Need that. Okay, it should be working. Mic working, yes. Okay, good. All right. Let me go ahead and just. Great. All right. So, I've looked at the calendar, and actually, let me go ahead and pull it back up because I won't remember the exact day. Where is it at? Where is it? Calendar. Our spring break is March 10th through the 14th. It's the second week of March. Um, so y'all's paper will be due. Oh no, that's not right. March 5th. So it's, I mean, still like almost 2 months out. So March 5th, Wednesday, March 5th will be when your guys' um, first paper will be due. I recognize that y'all's spring break will probably be in April. It'll be like the week of Easter, or maybe the week after Easter, or the week before or week after Easter. But that's going to be like the end of the semester for us, so that ain't going to work out. So our spring break for this class, at least, or for probably all of your Francis Marion classes, is going to be like the middle of March. So as far as the first paper, um, Wednesday, March 5th will be the first paper. So plenty of time before that. I don't think I've even gotten the subject up on Blackboard. I'll do that after class. So, um, again, plenty of time. I don't even remember what I usually have for the first subject. Oh, right, it's the westward expansion. Yeah. Um, yeah. What you think is like the biggest reason for westward expansion? We'll talk more about that as we get into that. Anyway, any questions from you guys before we get started? Great, let's get into the material then. Okay, so we start with chapter 14. For those of you that were here last semester, which is most of you, it's all one book. So we just start in the middle of the book and begin with chapter 14. For those of you that weren't here last semester, that's why we start with chapter 14. Bless you. If you do get the book, it just opens with 14. That's just, again, how it works. Don't worry about it. So we begin with the Reconstruction, 1863 to 1877. Unfortunately, at least me personally, the Reconstruction isn't the most engaging subject, because while it is important historically, not a whole lot gets done. Like, there is a lot of important stuff that gets done. A lot of like amendments are passed, but by the end of it, so much of it gets reversed that it's just kind of depressing. So let's go through it. Because it's there and it's important. But again, unfortunately, it's just kind of it's not. It doesn't get as much done as it needed to. So. Before the end of the Civil War, there was already some level of emancipation happening. Occupied areas in the South, such as the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina here, had freed slaves forming communities under the protection of Union soldiers. However, once the troops departed, the returning plantation owners obviously weren't too happy about said freed slaves being freed, and there would be conflict erupting between the two groups, and this would mirror things to come for quite some time. For example, in Richmond, Virginia, April of 1865, freed slaves would express their joy at emancipation, gathering, singing hymns. Once again, this would only last as long as there were Union troops there to keep the peace, because once the troops left, the former slave owners would attempt to punish the freed slaves for celebrating their freedom. And by punishment, typically that's violence. Whoops, don't know why that happened. So, this led to the formation of the Freedmen's Bureau, full name being the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, formed by Congress in 1865, signed into law by Lincoln. This provided aid to ex-slaves in the form of financial and legal resources, because while the slaves were freed, they were not made citizens, and obviously when you're freed from slavery, you have no kind of money. So they're not citizens, they have no legal rights, they have no kind of funds. They're just kind of cut loose into a society that is not favorable towards them, especially in the South. So one of the first goals for those that were freed was to reunite with their families, children, spouses, aunts, uncles, etc., because as we had seen last semester, a lot of the times during the slave auctions, families would be split up with no concern for, family cohesion, because they were seen as less than human. The Freedmen's Bureau and Northern Abolitionists would aid in this venture because it was very difficult due to many records being destroyed during the war, due in part to just destruction of property like Sherman's March, or simply the slave owners themselves destroying records to prevent punishment by the North once the war was over. So yeah, it was a whole thing. I remember my personal schooling. It was like the Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation and then everything was fine. It's like, it was not. It would not be for quite some time. So, in case you're not familiar with the Sea Islands, it's all these little islands off the coast. We're a lot more familiar with them down here. When I taught this originally, I was teaching it upstate, where's my mouse? Up here, up near the Georgia border, closer to Greenville. And a lot of folks had never been to the beach, and being as close to Myrtle Beach as we are here, that just seems weird to me. So yeah, I made sure to mention what the Sea Islands were. And also, as we talked about last semester, the Sea Islands were a special type of plantation. They didn't typically grow cotton there. It was mostly rice and indigo, that sort of thing. They were a lot like Barbados and the other Caribbean islands. And here we have, this would be like Richmond, where the slaves are receiving the news that they're not slaves anymore, and celebrating that. And I believe this is an image from the early 1900s. This is an anniversary of Emancipation Day. And here we have the Freedmen's Bureau, keeping the former slave owners and the former slaves from killing each other, although typically it was very one-sided, as we're going to see pretty soon here. Oh, right. This image is in the book that I'm about to show you guys. Fair warning, it's extremely racist, but, well, it's the 1800s. What are you going to do? This was this was the South's response to the Freedmen's Bureau. Because, anytime the downtrodden are given any kind of power or even just like a leg up, oh no, they're coming after you, the people who have been in power for the last 200 years. And they're going to take it from you by taking your money. You should fight back. Yeah, so we got to protect the white man. Boy, that sounds familiar. Gotta be afraid of the brown people. Anyway. So after finding their family, the freed black community was very interested in education. They were very aware that education was the only way that they could maintain their freedom. It's the best way to understand the politics and policies of the day, and maybe one day be able to vote, because as we're going to see very quickly, laws are very soon going to be put into place that, while not literally, virtually attempt to enslave them once again. Obviously, in the South, there was very little funding for schools, especially when it comes to, African Americans. And the demand for all these people who had once been enslaved was much higher than any supply could handle. So anywhere that people could gather would be used as schools, courthouses, cotton barns, even a mule stable at one point, as long as they could, get in out of the heat or cold, depending on the time of year. They would use it as a school. Now, this is something that I typically bring up in every class, and I'm going to see if those of you that have had my classes before remember. What is the main thing you think that they were interested in learning when it came to education? Like, number one most important thing when it comes to education? Just overall. What's that? Yeah. Like, what do you think that they wanted to learn more than anything? Even just really broadly. Yes. That's something I like to bring up pretty much every semester. Is when it comes to education, has two major components. You need to learn to be able to read, because if you can't read, you can't learn. And then you need to learn to be able to question what you read. You need to make sure whatever you're reading is a reliable source. Unfortunately, a lot of people don't do real good on that second part. So, main lesson was to learn to read. Now, obviously, this was real important to be able to read labor contracts, to ensure they weren't being taken advantage of, which was very common, not just for the freed blacks, because obviously any of the former slave owners that were now hiring the freed blacks were going to take advantage of them, but also any poor whites are often also taken advantage of, because they typically couldn't read either. So it's like, oh yeah, we'll give you this contract and pay you next to nothing. Once again, very common. But the main reason they wanted to be able to read was to be able to read the Bible. They wouldn't have to sit in southern churches and listen to southern preachers say that the Bible legitimized slavery, but they could instead read the Bible for themselves. And this caused an explosion of black churches. Black preachers were hired throughout the country. Church buildings were gathering places for communal purposes, in particular political gatherings, which we'd already seen some level of growth of free black churches last semester, with like Richard Allen, for example. But now that emancipation has happened, obviously there's a much bigger demand for that. So this is not just a religious thing, but like a communal and even political movement. So here we have the Freedmen's School. This one is actually built for that purpose. You can see there a little log cabin. And something to mention about these images, also I should mention, someone asked in my other class, the teachers for these schools were typically white abolitionists from the North who came down to teach, because obviously not too many people in the South were willing to do that. But also, with nearly all of these images, you don't just have children, but you also have adults, because obviously slaves weren't allowed to learn how to read. So once they were free, they were very eager to learn how to read. And it's much harder to, learn all this stuff as an adult when you had gone your whole life without learning the stuff. So you would have, adults in there with kids as well. So it's neat to see that sort of thing. And then, of course, the churches. And then I've got actually an image, photograph here of, I believe, a baptism happening. All right. So on to the Reconstruction. So Lincoln got the Reconstruction started, beginning with a proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction, beginning in December of 1863, which, if you're familiar at all with the years that the war lasted, this is 2 years before the war ended. The war was trending well for the North. So he believed the South had not constitutionally seceded from the Union, so he believed that we should go ahead and get the South back into the Union with a minimal amount of fuss, because the war was bad. I mean, the Civil War is, if I recall correctly, still like the greatest loss of life for Americans in terms of a war. Now, granted, deaths on both sides of the war were Americans, so yeah. But I mean, even like World War II, we didn't lose as many men on two fronts. So, let's see, his standards of acceptance: abolition of slavery, and 10% of those eligible to vote, which is to say white Southern men, had to swear an oath of allegiance to the United States, which is to say not be traitors. 10% of Southern white men agreeing to not be traitors seems kind of minor, but okay. Amnesty was also given to all but the highest ranking Confederate officials, which we'll get there. So Arkansas, Louisiana, and Tennessee had agreed to this 10% plan within a year and a half. Now, I need to explain this, and I'm probably going to have to explain it a couple more times because certain people like to, memory hole things. The party and political spectrum shifted in like the 1950s. In the 1800s, the Republicans in Congress were the liberal side. and the Democrats were the conservative side. The Democrats in the 1800s were the party of the South. They were the party of slavery. They were the party of the conservatives. And the Republicans in Congress, as we see here, wanted harsher restrictions on the South. They believed the South should be seen as conquered provinces. And the Wade-Davis bill would raise it to 50%, but Lincoln shot it down with a veto. Now, despite the veto, Lincoln did work with Congress on some things. 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. And again, as I said, he was trying to not be harsh on the South because we just had a war. And, I mean, even still, like, I've got really weird racist grandparents that are like, oh, the war just happened. It's like, y'all, it's been like 150 years. You should chill out. However, an idiot who thought he was doing the South a favor ended up shooting Lincoln and made things worse for everybody else. So Lincoln was assassinated in April of 1865 by John Wilkes Booth, obviously, and the White House was left to Andrew Johnson, who was one of our worst presidents. Yeah, we'll get to that in just a minute. So here is, there's John Wilkes Booth doing his thing. I really should have grabbed that picture from Bioshock Infinite, where it's got that, where it like deifies John Wilkes Booth as like this great martyr, because that was wild to see. So again, this is like, even though this is a siege, Lincoln was the 16th president, if I remember right. This was still sort of the Wild West of the presidency, because Andrew Johnson was the opposite party from Lincoln. Lincoln was a Republican and Johnson was a Democrat. And Johnson was chosen as Lincoln's running mate to get the border state votes, because this was like right before the Civil War and there was a whole lot of animosity between the parties. And also at this time, the vice president didn't really do anything. Like today, the president and the vice president work together really closely, and the vice president has a lot of like diplomatic jobs and does a lot of work in the Senate. And if there's like, tied votes, they cast the tie-breaking vote and that sort of thing. Back then, they were like the understudy in a play. They were there if they needed to be there, but if they didn't need to be there, they did nothing. They sat on their hands. And that was the expected job of the vice president, was to sit on their hands and do nothing. Well, unfortunately, Lincoln got shot, and now we needed Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson was not ready to be president. So, Johnson was born into rural poverty, and his big concern with the South was that he didn't like the Southern aristocracy. He believed that they were the big problem in the South. To him, slavery was just a tool that they used to gain more power, not really an actual evil. So while getting rid of slavery would hurt the aristocracy, that's fine. He had no concern with what happened to the slaves afterward. So he would have rich Southerners come to him directly to petition for amnesty, which he typically would grant. Basically, he wanted to humiliate the rich Southerners because he felt like they had done him personal wrong when he was growing up. He pretty much let the South more or less take care of itself, which meant that not much got done in terms of civil rights. Most of the states agreed to the requirements, 13th Amendment, Ordinance of Secession being revoked, which, is important because the South doesn't need to be seceded anymore, and refused to pay the Confederate war debts because, well, when you're in a war, you rack up a lot of debts, and the Confederacy went to war against the Union, and they can't. Basically, it's saying that the Southern states can't ask the Union to pay the debt that they accrued by fighting the Union. However, this led to many Confederate officials winning elections, like, for example, Georgia elected the Confederate Vice President, Alexander H. Stephens, into the Senate, because Georgia. South Carolina and Mississippi refused to repudiate the war debt, because, of course. And Mississippi refused to ratify the 13th Amendment, because, of course, Mississippi. Mississippi is going to be hanging on to that for a long time. They're the ones that had the Confederate battle flag in their state flag until, really recently. And then, because again, Johnson didn't care what happened to the black populace, black codes were passed in many southern states that restricted basic rights, such as bearing arms, intermarriage, and jury duty of the black population. Now, what this means, I'll get to that in just a second. In fact, this image, it needs to be on the next page. We're going to ignore it. So we have Reconstruction and how it works. This is a big piece with lots of information, and I don't think I've actually got it big enough to even read if you were to pull it out of the PowerPoint yourself. There were a lot of riots, and I don't know why, but for some reason Johnson was put in this little jester suit a lot. There's a lot going on here. Let's see. Harper's Weekly. We're going to get a lot of Harper's Weekly. I love Harper's Weekly. Spirit of Concord and Brotherly Affection. First Gun, First Blood. Tears of Joy, which is to say crocodile tears. Patriotic sentiment, yada, yada, yada. So, if you're not familiar with the wording of the 13th Amendment, it says that slavery is no longer allowed in the United States except for a punishment for crimes, or for those in prison, or something along those lines. Basically, you can't be enslaved unless you're imprisoned. So, the South made a bunch of laws that very specifically targeted the black population. So a bunch of black folk got sent to jail for being black, and suddenly we had a big black slave population again. Weird how that works. And because Andrew Johnson didn't care, they could just do that. And then we had, worse than that. The White Leagues and the KKK, which we'll get to in just a second, says here, worse than slavery, which, that's saying something, but in a way, while they were free, they were living in fear because these people were going around and just shooting people in their homes. So, let's get into that. Republican lawmakers were not happy with how Johnson was handling things. So when Southern lawmakers tried to return to Congress, they were barred from entry. Johnson announced this as legitimate, and, well, Congress wasn't having it. So Johnson refused to sign a bill to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, vetoed the Civil Rights Act, because of course he did. The Civil Rights Act was supposed to protect the free people from the black codes because, you know, these codes were literally just targeting black people to put them in jail to have slavery again. And this pushed moderates and radicals into the same camp. Johnson argued Freedmen's Bureau infringed on the rights of the states to handle their own economic affairs. You know, to enslave people again. So in April of 1866, Congress repassed both the Freedmen's Bureau extension and the Civil Rights Act over Johnson's veto. What that means is that Congress had a 2/3 majority voting in the same direction. I think it's 2/3 to override a veto. That meant that Johnson pissed off a lot of Congress to work together against him. That takes a lot. In June, they adopted the 14th Amendment, covered the provisions of the Civil Rights Act, overturned the Dred Scott case which said that blacks were not citizens. So the 14th Amendment made African Americans into actual citizens and essentially enshrined the Civil Rights Act into law. So the black codes were no longer allowed to be a thing. You couldn't make laws that specifically targeted someone based on their race. You freaking weirdos in the South, what's going on? Lawmakers realized they needed to move quickly because things were getting worse in the South. Massive anti-black riot in Memphis, for example. Do I have a Yeah. For a day and a half, white mobs egged on by local police went on a rampage during which they terrorized black residents of the city and burned houses and churches. The late riots in our city, the editor of Memphis newspaper asserted, have satisfied all of one thing, that the Southern men will not be ruled by, and, well, the 1800s word for African Americans. So yeah, because they were there, they felt that they were being ruled by people who couldn't even vote. Because once again, white fragility, I guess. Meanwhile, Johnson was encouraging Southern states to reject the 14th Amendment because Johnson was just a little bitch like that. However, his home state of Tennessee was the first and only to initially accept the 14th Amendment. So here's this image used correctly. Johnson vetoing the Freedmen's Bureau. If you're not familiar, the Bureau is another term for chest of drawers. So, with moderates and radicals working against the president, they began passing important legislation. They both agreed that blacks needed access to the vote, otherwise they would simply be enslaved again. And again, here moderates are people who were basically, hey, we shouldn't have slavery, but also black people aren't equal to white people, so whatever. But due to what was happening in the South, they were like, hey, even though we're still really racist, they need to be able to vote, otherwise they're just going to be enslaved again. Bless you. So, Congress passed the Military Reconstruction Acts. The South was split into, the 10 southern states minus Tennessee, because Tennessee was actually behaving, which is weird because I've got family from Tennessee. Were split into 5 military districts under the supervision of a Union general and his troops. The male voters in each state, which is to say the voters in each state, had to elect delegates that would create a convention minus Confederate officials because, again, treason. They would then draft a constitution, guarantee black suffrage, ratify the 14th Amendment. Within a year, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas had done so and were readmitted into the Union. So we actually behaved. What do you know? So once most of the states had done as they were told, a couple of states, let's see, Texas, Mississippi, of course, Georgia, and Virginia they took a couple more years. But once most of the states had done as they were supposed to, Congress turned their attention to Johnson, who had tried to undermine all of this by using his authority as the commander-in-chief, because technically the president has authority over the army. And, well, the army is the one running this whole military district thing. So, he was basically telling the generals use my brain. He was telling the generals to go easier on the South than they needed to. So, Congress passed the Command of the Army Act, which forced Johnson to go through the General of the Army in Washington, the General of the Army being Ulysses S. Grant, who, if you're not familiar, was the General of the Army during the Civil War. So he wasn't exactly a sympathizer to the South. Also, he won the election in 1868, and, we'll get to him later. They also passed a Tenure of Office Act, which made it so that Johnson could not remove cabinet members without Senate approval, which he did, which caused him to be technically, though not fully, impeached, which meant that they passed terms of impeachment, and while it passed the House, it did not pass the Senate. But what it did mean is that for normal humans, he realized he was in trouble, and he sat down and behaved himself after this. Because normally, when they pass articles of impeachment, you behave yourself. So here are the military districts. They're actually color-coded here. They're not color-coded in the book. They just got, like, bold lines between where they would be. It seems weird that, like, for example, Texas is combined with Louisiana, or there's 3 states here, while Virginia has 1. But you gotta remember, Virginia was really heavily populated, whereas Texas was not, and Florida was not at the time. Florida's more heavily populated now because of, like, Miami, and Texas still really isn't. And there's Grant. All right. Let's see how much further we can go. So in 1869, the 15th Amendment was passed, which was pushing for black suffrage, which was initially passed in the Military Reconstruction Acts, but this made it an amendment, so it would, stay on the books. Now, this protected voting based on race. However, voting could still be denied based on literacy, payment of taxes, moral character, whatever the hell that means, and other random things that will be used to deny the vote because it's the 1800s and nobody cares. Now, an amendment being passed is not the same as an amendment being ratified. Being passed means it's sent to the states for the states to ratify before it actually becomes an amendment. So, this means the battle is on for the states to ratify it. So the Anti-Slavery Society disbanded when slavery was over, but they realized that, well, that's only part of the fight, and they reformed as the American Equal Rights Association. So there were concerns about the 14th Amendment as it inserted the word male into the Constitution for the first time. Most of the time it was like citizen or a person. This was repeated with the 15th Amendment as it also excluded women from the vote. So once again, like it takes us until 1919 before women get the right to vote. Some people wanted female suffrage before black suffrage, while others believed that extending the vote to freedmen would pave the way to the vote for women, which, I mean, maybe it did, but it sure took a while. So this led to two groups. The National Women's Suffrage Association, who had Stanton and Anthony, opposed the 15th Amendment, while the American Women's Suffrage Association, which had men and women, black and white, who supported the amendment. So 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, but women were excluded. So once again, it takes another 4 amendments before we actually get female suffrage. And this is a number of suffragettes who are actually protesting a woman who was arrested for attempting to vote. To ask for freedom for women is not a crime. Suffrage prisoners should not be treated as criminals. There's a Women's Suffrage Association meeting. Alright, I was able to finish this in the other class. Let's see how, well, we've still got like 30 minutes. We might be able to finish it. So, Johnson's put in the corner. Reconstruction finally got underway. So, once again, oh no, people that aren't white have some amount of power. We're going to get murdered. None of that happened. White still had the majority of the power in the South. Only one rebel was actually executed for war crimes. This was the commandant of the Andersonville prison in Georgia. And while I don't actually have like details over what he did, the prison was basically a death camp. Like, if you got sent there, you were going to die. So, yeah, he was executed for war crimes. And only one official actually went to prison. It was Jefferson Davis, you know, the president of the Confederacy. And I want to say he was only in prison for, like, 7 years. It wasn't an especially long time. And within 7 years of the war, most rebels had the right to vote and hold office. It's not like today where if you get found with, you know, an ounce of weed or whatever, oh no, you're a felon for the rest of your life and you can't vote. Back then it's like, oh, you went to war against America? Well, you know, just cool your heels for a couple of years and you can hold office again. So the first few years of Reconstruction, there were two groups of whites that had the majority of power in the South. There were Republicans within the South who opposed secession to begin with. They were typically merchants or mountain dwellers, those who were not at all tied to slavery. They were called scalawags, which is another term for scoundrels, because we're just going to go full, like, 19th century pirates here. by the Democrats, who saw them as traitors. The other group were Northerners, who moved to the South to aid the Reconstruction, saw it as a new frontier because the South was like 100 years behind the North in terms of the Industrial Revolution. They were seen as coming to plunder the resource-rich South before returning home with everything they could carry, and were called carpetbaggers. Because they typically had like bags made of this carpet material. And while certainly not being the majority, the now free, now able to vote blacks were very enthusiastic about being able to vote and hold office. Although they had to work with whites who were actually agreeable with working with them. They did help to shape the politics of the time. Sharecropping was the main agricultural arrangement of the time, which is not especially lucrative at all. While exodusters, black communities heading west, began cropping up as black communities would leave the South and attempt to make a home for themselves elsewhere. Now this wasn't like where we're going to go in the next couple of chapters as far as like the far west. This was, Arkansas and stuff. But it's out of the deep South. So, if you're anything like me, I don't know how your high school was, or is, you guys are still in school. But carpetbaggers and scalawags were always seen as only negative. Like this, for example. Carpetbaggers is pitifully plain, use Southern defeat for personal gain. Yeah, oh no, the poor defeated South that were totally innocent and had nothing to do with the war. I mean, look at this guy with his Snidely Whiplash-ass mustache and top hat. And then here we have a slide someone else put together that I blatantly stole offline. Scalawag, rascal, someone who supports the cause for his or her own gain. White Southern Republicans were known to their enemies as scalawags. Meanwhile, carpetbaggers moved to the Southern states to Reconstruction years for their own benefit. Packed their belongings in suitcases made out of carpet-like material, which you can see here. And you can kind of see from how this person's drawn, they were also depicted as very Jewish. Because obviously. Because anti-Semitism is all the time. And here we have some exodusters making their way westward. Also, I like this image because this road surrounded by just swamp reminds me of some places I've been here in South Carolina. All right. Obviously, the white folks here in the South weren't too happy about the Reconstruction, especially the interracial governments that often cropped up during Reconstruction. They accused it of corruption. For example, as early as 1870 Virginia, and as late as 1877 Louisiana, Florida, South Carolina, Republican governments were voted out in favor of Democrats. Actually, I forgot to mention this in my Tuesday, Thursday class. There was a government there was a small town, I think it might have been in Virginia, it was either Virginia or North Carolina. It was like a city council, or maybe even the mayor, was largely elected black, and you had these weirdos, um, these racists that just came in and like threatened to burn the town down if they didn't kick these people out. Like they literally overthrew the government because they were black. Like it was ridiculous. And it just happened because it was the 1800s, and yeah, nobody talks about it. But I've seen stuff about it. It's crazy. So, speaking of which, you had these governments voted out in favor of Democrats who claimed to be bringing redemption to the South. These redeemers did win the vote, but through violence, intimidation, and voter fraud. One group of redeemers who used threats of violence and actual violence was founded in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee by General Nathan Bedford Forrest. He brought together Confederate veterans into the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. I'm sure everybody knows this group. Used physical force to frighten free people away from the ballot boxes, and when fear didn't work, they just straight up murdered people. They killed 150 African Americans in 1871 in Jackson County, Florida, and hundreds of Republicans in 1875 in Mississippi. So yeah, they either intimidated people away from the ballot box, or they just killed people. And they would use this to get their people in office so that they could use political power to further beat down their opponents. Eventually, the government stepped in. Force Acts in 1870 and 71 to prevent voting fraud. 1872, there was a joint committee to probe Klan activities. 13 volumes of vivid testimony of Klan activities and atrocities they committed. So we have here... Elias Hill, a freedman from South Carolina, had become a Baptist preacher. He and his brother lived next door to each other. Klansmen went first to his brother's house, where, as Hill testified, they broke open the door and attacked his wife. Heard her screaming and moaning. As I heard them rape her in the yard, she was crying, and the Ku Klux Klan and the Klan were whipping her to make her tell where I lived. When Klansmen finally discovered him, they dragged him out of the house, accused him of preaching against the Klan, beat and whipped him, and threatened to kill him. On the basis of such testimony, the federal government prosecuted some 3,000 Klansmen. Only 600 were convicted. As the Klan disbanded on the wake of federal prosecution, other vigilante organizations arose to take its place. And the Klan was refounded like 2 more times. And it very much still exists. So, we have stuff like this. This is The White Man's Government by Thomas Nast in Harper's Weekly, which we're going to see a lot of Harper's Weekly. So you've got Forrest here. I think this is Greeley. We'll talk about Greeley in a minute. I'm not sure who this is over here, but you've got these folks working together to, of course, stamp out or stamp down African Americans, because they're seen as this great threat. Because there's always some terrible threat that, the people in power have to band together against, or at least pretend like they've got to fight against. And there's the Klan. This one's actually in the book, where they just would break into people's homes and shoot women and children. Here we are. This is Horace Greeley. We'll talk more about him on the next slide. So it says down here, "Let us clasp hands over the bloody chasm." This was a quote, I think, by Ulysses S. Grant, which was his opponent in the in the election, which was, um, we need to work together past the Civil War. Well, here we have Greeley and a member of, if not the Klan, at least one of these white leagues, clasping hands over piles of dead bodies, so that they'd be able to win. And again, basically the same thing. Clasp hands over the bloody chasm. So, okay, yeah, we are almost there. We'll be able to finish it today. Despite fighting for civil rights, most Northerners agreed that their southern counterparts that blacks were inferior to whites and not fit to govern themselves, because again, this is 1800s and everybody's really racist. So Republicans challenged Grant for re-election in 1872. They nominated Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, who worked with the Democrats who ousted Grant for exposing financial corruption. Grant used the bloody flag, said that votes against Grant tarnished the memory of those killed in the war. Also, they had just put down the Arlington Cemetery, so the sacrifices of the Civil War were still fresh in people's memory. So despite Grant winning a second term in 1872, Republican power was very much waning in the South. Congress moved most of the remaining penalties on Confederate officials in 72, and by 74, Democrats gained a majority of power in the South for the first time since the war and began removing troops. And this is something we're going to see a lot of. A financial panic after a collapse of the Northern Pacific Railroad caused people to shift their focus from, the treatment of human beings to, oh no, economic concerns. And when workers were striking, companies were more concerned about having the troops come and break the strikes than the troops being used to keep the black populace safe. And then the 14th Amendment's protections were narrowed to the point that the Civil Rights Act was basically struck down in 1875. So we'll get into like Jim Crow laws a little bit later, but this was, I don't remember exactly at what point, I need to look this up, but the 14th Amendment is basically used today, not so much that you can't restrict the vote based on race, but more that corporations are people and that they can, a corporation can donate as much money as it wants to a political campaign, which wasn't allowed before they changed the 14th Amendment. So, and not only that, but corporations are protected by the 14th Amendment in a way that protects them from their employees rather than protecting their employees from abuse by the corporation. It's weird. But we'll get into that. We'll get into the hell that is the Industrial Revolution. Don't you worry. So here we have what I know about Horace Greeley. This is another one of those 1800s memes from Harper's Weekly. The traitor working with Jefferson Davis. Then here trying to sling mud on Grant. Mudslinging, if you're not familiar, is just, trying to cause trouble. Here we have Grant, liberal gratitude. Now that the good ship Union has safely passed to the Sea of Trouble, into peaceful waters shall the helmsman be thrown overboard. And then here we have what I know about steering on the paper he's reading. And I don't know who this long-legged motherfucker is here, but these cartoons were interesting. And then here he is, like, literally making a deal with the devil. All right. Presidential Compromise of 1876. This is both really important and not at all, because the guy who wins does nothing, but also it's like a super big deal. So, 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes was nominated by Republicans, Civil War officer, free of corruption of Grant's the administration. Democrats nominated Samuel J. Tilden, who fought corruption in New York. Great. Everybody's anti-corruption. We're all super anti-corruption. Wonderful. So the outcome depended on 20 disputed votes. Tilden won 51% of the popular vote, but nobody cares because apparently popular votes don't matter, which is dumb, but what do I know? Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina kept victory on the line. Outgoing Republicans certified Hayes. Incoming Democrats gave their votes to Tilden, which, again, doesn't make sense because, like, if you're being voted out, why do you get a vote on who becomes president? That doesn't make sense to me. But whatever. Split in the Senate and the House of Representatives, Congress created a 15-member joint electoral commission, 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent. Obviously, the independent knew where he was sitting and got off the panel. His replacement voted with Republicans confirming Hayes. Congress had ratified the decision, so the Democrats threatened a filibuster to hold decision until inauguration, which would have caused a crisis. Compromise 1877. Hayes was allowed into the White House. However, a Southerner had to be elected to the cabinet. Federal troops had to be withdrawn from the South, and a transcontinental railroad had to be built through the South, which, I mean, that was good for their economy, just period. This proved that Southern Democrats had power and that the free people in the South would no longer be protected by the federal government because they, well, had pulled all the troops out. So this shows the weird back and forth of that. Now, the book doesn't go into this, but there was this weird, like, Tilden or blood thing over this, where the South was sort of threatening another civil war. The KKK was there as well. Yeah. And this wasn't some idle thing. This is Harper's Weekly again. So Harper's Weekly was pretty on point with stuff. Compromise with the South in memory of the Union heroes lost in a useless war. So yeah, Reconstruction was pretty limited. Free people were not afforded land ownership, which would give them economic independence. Redeemers soon took over and reversed what the federal government did. Republican Party shifted focus. Democratic Party blocked what was there. And then, of course, everybody was really racist, so things didn't really get very far. However, at least slavery was over. At least as far as, those that weren't in prison. So yeah, that's it for chapter 14. We'll do chapter 15 on Wednesday. I just needed to get through the Reconstruction. We'll get into chapter 15 is, the frontier. It's slightly less depressing. So yeah, we'll do that next time. We won't be doing like a chapter a day normally. I was able to do this in one shot last time, and I wanted to go ahead and get it done for you guys. So yeah, I'll see you guys on Wednesday.